I wondered at the existence of the universe. I wondered where it came from. Did it have a beginning? Or has it always existed? I remember lying in bed at night trying to think of a beginningless universe. Every event would be preceded by another event, back and back into the past with no stopping point, or more accurately, no starting point. An infinite past with no beginning. My mind reeled at the prospect. It just seemed inconceivable to me. There must have been a beginning at some point, I thought, in order for everything to get started. Little did I suspect that for centuries, millennia really, men had grappled with the idea of an infinite past and the question of whether there had been a beginning to the universe. Ancient Greek philosophers believed that matter was necessary and uncreated, and therefore eternal. God may be responsible for introducing order into the cosmos, but he did not create the universe itself. This Greek view was in contrast to even more ancient Jewish thought about the subject. Hebrew writers held that the universe has not always existed, but was created by God at some point in the past. As the first verse of the Hebrew Holy Scriptures states, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. Eventually, these two competing traditions began to interact, and there arose within Western philosophy an ongoing debate that lasted for well over 1,000 years about whether or not the universe had a beginning. This debate played itself out among Jews and Muslims, as well as among Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. It finally sputtered to something of an inconclusive end in the thought of the great 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He held, ironically, that there are rationally compelling arguments for both sides, thereby exposing the bankruptcy of reason itself. What is the argument which stirred such interest? Let's allow one of the greatest medieval protagonists in this debate to speak for himself. Al-Ghazali was a 12th century Muslim theologian from Persia, or modern-day Iran. He was concerned that the Muslim philosophers of his day were being influenced by ancient Greek philosophy to deny God's creation of the universe. After thoroughly studying the teachings of these philosophers, Ghazali wrote a withering critique of their views entitled The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In this fascinating book, he argues that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd. The universe must have a beginning, and since nothing begins to exist without a cause, there must be a transcendent creator of the universe. Ghazali formulates his argument very simply. He writes, every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning. Ghazali's reasoning involves three simple steps. One, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. Two, the universe began to exist. Three, therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning. Let's look at each step of this argument this morning. First, premise one. Notice that Ghazali does not need a premise so strong as one in order for his argument to succeed. The first premise could be more modestly stated as one prime. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. This more modest version of the first premise will enable us to avoid distractions about whether subatomic particles, which are the result of quantum decay processes, come into being without a cause. This alleged exception to 1 is irrelevant to 1 prime. For the universe comprises all of contiguous space-time reality. Therefore, for the whole universe to come into being without a cause is for it to come into being from nothing, which is absurd. In quantum decay events, the particles do not come into being from nothing. As Christopher Isham, Britain's premier quantum cosmologist, explains, and I quote, "Care is needed when using the word creation in a physical context. One familiar example is the creation of elementary particles in an accelerator. However, what occurs in this situation is the conversion of one type of matter into another, with the total amount of energy being preserved in the process." So this alleged exception to premise 1 is not an exception to 1 prime. Let me give 3 reasons in support of premise 1 prime. First, something cannot come from nothing. To claim that something can come from nothing is literally worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. But if you deny premise 1 prime, you've got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. But nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause. 2, if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer just pop into being from nothing? Why is it only universes that can pop into existence from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? Now, of course, I'm being facetious here. There can't be anything about nothingness that favors universes, for nothingness doesn't have any properties, nor can anything constrain nothingness, because there isn't anything to be constrained. Number 3, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1 prime. The science of cosmogony is based on the assumption that there are causal conditions for the origin of the universe. So it's hard to understand how anyone who is committed to modern science could deny that 1 prime is more plausibly true than false. So I think that the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is surely true. What about premise 2? Premise 2 is the more controversial premise in the argument, that the universe began to exist. This is by no means obvious. So let's examine both philosophical arguments and scientific evidence in support of premise 2. Let's talk first about the first philosophical argument. Ghazali argued that if the universe never began to exist, then there have been an infinite number of past events prior to today. But, he argued, an infinite number of things cannot exist. Ghazali recognized that a potentially infinite number of things could exist, but he denied that an actually infinite number of things could exist. When we say that something is potentially infinite, infinity serves merely as an ideal limit which is never reached. For example, you could divide any distance in half, and then into fourths, and then into eighths, and then into sixteenths, and so on indefinitely to infinity. The number of divisions is potentially infinite, in the sense that you could go on dividing endlessly. But you would never reach an infinity F division. You would never have an actually infinite number of parts or divisions. The symbol for this type of infinity is the lazy 8 or lemniscate. This is the type of infinity that is used in calculus. It is merely an ideal limit which is approached but never attained. This is in contrast to the idea of an actual infinite, which is used in set theory to speak of events which have an actually infinite number of members in them. And the symbol for this type of infinity is the Hebrew letter Aleph. Now, Ghazali has no problem with the existence of a merely potentially infinite number of things, for the potential infinite is just an ideal limit. But he argued that if an actually infinite number of things could exist, then various absurdities would result. If we're to avoid these absurdities, then we must deny that an actually infinite number of things exist. That implies that the number of past events cannot be actually infinite. Therefore, the universe cannot be beginningless. Rather, the universe began to exist. Now, it's very frequently alleged that this type of argument has been invalidated by developments in modern mathematics. In modern set theory, the use of actually infinite sets is commonplace. For example, the set of natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, and so on, has an actually infinite number of members in it. The number of members in this set is not merely potentially infinite, according to modern set theory. Rather, the number of members is actually infinite. And many people have inferred from these developments that this undermines Ghazali's argument. But is that really the case? Modern set theory shows that if you adopt certain axioms and rules, then you can talk about actually infinite collections in a consistent way without contradicting yourself. All this accomplishes is showing how to set up a certain universe of discourse for talking consistently about actual infinites. But it does absolutely nothing to show that such mathematical entities really exist, or that an actually infinite number of things can really exist. If Ghazali is right, then this universe of discourse may be regarded as just a fictional realm, like the world of Sherlock Holmes, or something that just exists in your mind. The way in which Ghazali brings out the real impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences. Let me share one of my favorite illustrations called Hilbert's Hotel, which is the brainchild of the great German mathematician David Hilbert. Hilbert first invites us to imagine an ordinary hotel with a finite number of rooms. Suppose furthermore that all the rooms are full. If a new guest shows up at the desk asking for a room, the manager says, "Sorry, all the rooms are full." And that's the end of the story. But now, Hilbert says, let's imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And let's suppose, once again, that all the rooms are full. Now, this needs to be clearly appreciated. There is not a single vacant room throughout the entire infinite hotel. Every room has a real flesh and blood person in it. Now suppose a new guest shows up at the front desk asking for a room. "No problem," says the manager. And he moves the person who was staying in room number 1 into room number 2. The person who was staying in room number 2 into room number 3. the person who was in room number 3 into room number 4, and so on out to infinity. As a result of these room changes, room number 1 now becomes vacant, and the new guest gratefully checks in. But before he arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even worse. Let's now suppose, Hilbert says, that an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk asking for rooms. No problem, says the manager. And he moves the person who was staying in room 1 into room 2. The person who was in room 2 into room 4. The person who was in room 3 into room 6, moving each person into the room number twice his own. Now, since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all of the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests is easily accommodated. In fact, the manager could do this an infinite number of times and always accommodate infinitely more guests. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. As a student once remarked to me, Hilbert's hotel, if it could exist, would have to have a sign posted outside, "No vacancy, guests welcome." Can such a hotel exist in reality? Hilbert's hotel is absurd. Since nothing hangs on the illustrations involving a hotel, the argument can be generalized to show that the existence of an actually infinite number of things is absurd. Now, sometimes students react to Hilbert's hotel by saying that these absurdities result because the concept of infinity is beyond us and we can't understand it. But this reaction is mistaken and naive. As I said, infinite set theory is a highly developed and well understood branch of modern mathematics. These absurdities result precisely because we do understand the nature of the actual infinite. Hilbert was a smart guy, and he knew well how to illustrate the bizarre consequences of the existence of an actually infinite number of things. Really, the only thing the critic can do at this point is to just bite the bullet and say that a Hilbert's hotel is not absurd. Sometimes critics will try to justify this move by saying that if an actual infinite could exist, then such situations are exactly what we should expect. But this response is inadequate. Hilbert would of course agree that if an actual infinite could exist, then the situation with his imaginary hotel is what we would expect. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good illustration, right? So the question is whether such a hotel really is possible. So I think that Ghazali's first argument is a good one. It shows that the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the universe must have had a beginning. We can summarize Ghazali's first argument as follows. 1, an actual infinite cannot exist. 2, an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite. 3, therefore, an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. Now, Ghazali has a second, independent philosophical argument for the beginning of the universe. The series of past events, Ghazali observes, has been formed by adding one event after another. The series of past events is like a sequence of dominoes falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. But, he argues, no series which is formed by adding one member at a time can be actually infinite, for you cannot pass through an infinite number of elements, one at a time. This is easy to see in the case of trying to count to infinity. No matter how high you count, there is always an infinity of numbers left to count. But if you can't count to infinity, how could you count down from infinity? This would be like someone's claiming to have counted down all of the negative numbers, ending at 0, -3, -2, -1, 0. This seems crazy. For before he could count 0, he would have to count -1. But before he could count -1, he would have to count -2. But before he could count -2, he would have to count -3, and so on back to infinity. Before any number could be counted, an infinity of numbers will have to have been counted first. You just get driven back and back into the past so that no number could ever be counted. But then the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously here we are. This shows that the series of past events must be finite and have a beginning. Ghazali sought to heighten the impossibility of forming an infinite past by giving illustrations of the absurdities that would result if it could be done. For example, suppose that for every one orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the farther Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, they will approach a limit at which Saturn is infinitely far behind Jupiter. Of course, they will never actually arrive at this limit. But now, turn the story around. Suppose Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Which will have completed the most orbits? The answer is that the number of their orbits is exactly the same. Infinity. And you can't slip out of this argument by saying that infinity is not a number. In modern mathematics, it is a number. The number of elements in the set 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the greater the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of orbits magically become equal by making them orbit from eternity past? Here's another illustration. Suppose we meet someone who claims to have been counting down from eternity past and is now finishing. -2, -3, -1, 0. Why, we may ask, is he just finishing his countdown today? Why didn't he finish yesterday? Or the day before that? After all, by then, an infinite amount of time had already elapsed. So if the man were counting at a rate of 1 number per second, he's already had an infinite number of seconds to complete his countdown. He should already be done. In fact, at any point in the past, he has already had infinite time, and so should already have finished. But then at no point in the past can we find the man finishing his countdown, which contradicts the hypothesis that he has been counting from eternity. These illustrations only strengthen Ghazali's claim that no series which is formed by adding one member after another can be actually infinite. Since the series of past events has been formed by adding one member after another, it can't be actually infinite. It must have had a beginning. So, we have a second good philosophical argument for premise 2, that the universe began to exist. We can summarize this argument as follows. 1, a collection formed by successive addition cannot be an actual infinite. 2, the temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition. 3, therefore, the temporal series of events cannot be actually infinite. One of the most astonishing developments of modern astronomy, which Ghazali could never have anticipated, is that we now have strong scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. And there are two scientific confirmations of the universe's beginning. The first comes from the expansion of the universe. All throughout history, men have assumed that the universe as a whole was unchanging. Of course, things in the universe were moving about and changing, but the universe as a whole was just there, so to speak. This was also Albert Einstein's assumption when he first began to apply his new theory of gravity, called the general theory of relativity, to the universe in 1917. But Einstein found that there was something terribly amiss. His equations described a universe which was either blowing up like a balloon or else collapsing in upon itself. During the 1920s, the Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann and the Belgian astronomer Georges Lemaitre decided to take Einstein's equations at face value. And as a result, they came up independently with models of an expanding universe. In 1929, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble, through tireless observations at Mount Wilson Observatory, made a startling discovery which verified Friedmann and Lemaitre's theory. He found that the light from distant galaxies appeared to be redder than expected. This red shift in the light was most plausibly due to the stretching of the light waves as the galaxies are moving away from us. Wherever Hubble trained his telescope in the night sky, he observed this same red shift in the light from the galaxies. It appeared that we are at the center of a cosmic explosion, and all of the other galaxies are flying away from us at fantastic speeds. Now, according to the Friedmann-Lemaitre model, we're not really at the center of the universe. Rather, any observer in any galaxy will look out and see the other galaxies moving away from him. This is because, according to the theory, it is really space itself which is expanding. The galaxies are actually at rest in space, but they recede from one another as space itself expands. The Friedmann-Lemaitre model eventually came to be known as the Big Bang Theory, but that name can be misleading. Speaking of the expansion of the universe as a sort of explosion could mislead us into thinking that the galaxies are moving out into a pre-existing empty space from a central point. And that would be a complete misunderstanding of the theory. The theory is much more radical than that. As you trace the expansion of the universe back in time, everything gets closer and closer together. Eventually, the distance between any 2 points in space becomes zero. You can't get any closer than that. So at that point, you've reached the boundary of space and time. Space and time cannot be extended any further back than that. It's literally the beginning of space and time. To get a picture of this, we can portray our three-dimensional space as a two-dimensional disk, which shrinks as you go back in time. Eventually, the distance between any 2 points in space becomes zero. So, space-time can be represented geometrically as a cone. What's significant about this is that while a cone can be extended indefinitely in one direction, it has a boundary point in the other direction. Because this direction represents time and the boundary point lies in the past, the model implies that past time is finite and had a beginning. Because space-time is the arena in which all matter and energy exist, the beginning of space-time is also the beginning of all matter and energy. It is the beginning of the universe. Now, notice that there's simply nothing prior to the initial boundary of space-time. But let's not be misled by words. When cosmologists say there is nothing prior to the initial boundary, they do not mean that there is some state of affairs prior to it, and that is a state of nothingness. That would be to treat nothing as though it were something. Rather, they mean that at that boundary point, it is false that there is something prior to this point. The standard Big Bang model thus predicts an absolute beginning of the universe. If this model is correct, then we have amazing scientific confirmation of the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. So, is the model correct? Or more importantly, is it correct in its prediction of a beginning of the universe? Despite its empirical confirmation, the standard Big Bang model will need to be modified in various ways. The model is based, as we've seen, on Einstein's general theory of relativity. But Einstein's theory breaks down when space is shrunk down to subatomic proportions. We'll need to introduce quantum physics at that point, and no one is sure how this is to be done. Moreover, the expansion of the universe is probably not constant as it is in the standard model. It's probably accelerating and may have had a brief moment of super rapid expansion in the past. But none of these adjustments need affect the fundamental prediction of the absolute beginning of the universe. Indeed, physicists have proposed scores of alternative models over the decades since Friedman and Lemaitre's work, and those that do not have an absolute beginning have been repeatedly shown to be unworkable. Put more positively, the only viable non-standard models have been those that involve an absolute beginning to the universe. That beginning may or may not involve a beginning point. But on theories such as Stephen Hawking's famous no-boundary proposal that do not have a point-like beginning, the past is still finite, not infinite. The universe has not existed forever, according to such theories, but came into existence even if it didn't do so at a sharply defined point. In a sense, the history of 20th century cosmology can be seen as a series of one failed attempt after another to avoid the absolute beginning predicted by the standard Big Bang model. That prediction has now stood for nearly 100 years during a period of enormous advances in observational astronomy and creative theoretical work in astrophysics. Meanwhile, a series of remarkable singularity theorems has increasingly tightened the loop around empirically tenable models by showing that under more and more generalized conditions, a beginning is inevitable. In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning. And that goes for multiverse scenarios too. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that models which do not meet this one condition still fail for other reasons to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning," end quote. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical space-time under a single, very general condition cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary just is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, it will be a region described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. For a quantum regime is unstable and therefore cannot have endured for infinite time. Either way, then, the universe began to exist. Now, of course, scientific results are always provisional, and we can fully expect that new theories will be proposed attempting to avoid the universe's absolute beginning. Such proposals are to be welcomed and tested. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear which way the evidence points. Today, the proponent of Ghazali's cosmological argument stands comfortably within the scientific mainstream in holding that the universe began to exist. Now, as if this were not enough, there is actually a second scientific confirmation of the beginning of the universe from thermodynamics. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that and move immediately to my conclusion. On the basis of both philosophical and scientific evidence, we have good grounds for believing that the universe began to exist. It therefore follows that the universe has a cause of its beginning. So, what properties must this cause possess? This cause must itself be uncaused, because we've seen that an infinite series of causes is impossible. It is therefore the uncaused first cause. It must transcend space and time, since it created space and time. Therefore, it must be immaterial and non-physical. It must be unimaginably powerful, since it created all matter and energy. Finally, Ghazali argued that this uncaused first cause must also be a personal being. It's the only way to explain how an eternal cause can produce an effect with a beginning like the universe. Here's the problem. If the cause is sufficient to produce its effect, then if the cause is there, the effect must be there as well. For example, the cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees Celsius. If the temperature has been below 0 degrees from eternity, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water to begin to freeze just a finite time ago. Now, the cause of the universe is permanently there, since it is timeless. So why isn't the universe permanently there as well? Why did the universe come into being only 14 billion years ago? Why isn't it as permanent as its cause? Ghazali maintained that the answer to this problem is that the first cause must be a personal being, endowed with freedom of the will. His creating the universe is a free act which is independent of any prior determining conditions. So his act of creating can be something that is spontaneous and new. Freedom of the will enables one to get an effect with a beginning from a permanent, timeless cause. And thus we're brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Now, this is admittedly hard for us to imagine. But one way to think about it is to envision the creator existing alone, without the universe, as changeless and timeless. His free act of creation is a temporal event simultaneous with the universe's coming into being. Therefore, he enters into time when he creates the universe. The creator is thus timeless without the universe and in time with the universe. The cosmological argument thus gives us powerful grounds for believing in the existence of a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, changeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which is what everybody means by God.
Dr. Craig will remain on stage as we move to a time of Q&A. So what we have in the center aisle is a mic stand, and if you would like to ask questions, please feel free to approach the mic, introduce yourself briefly, and state your question briefly as well. So are there anyone who would like to ask a question? Anybody?
Good morning, Dr. Craig. I understand that due to constraint of time, you were not able to elaborate on a more later recent discovery to prove Einstein's theory of relativity and what it is the discovery of gravitational waves. I was wondering if you could give a comment on that, on how that further affirms the second hypothesis of Kalam's cosmological.
Yes, thank you for that very informed question. Some of you may have seen in the news lately that scientists have been able to discover experimentally gravitational waves. And these were predicted by Einstein's general theory of relativity, but heretofore have remained undetected. But what these are ripples, so to speak, in space-time that are the way in which gravitational force is carried. Now, what is perhaps most significant about this for our argument is that up to this point, observational astronomy has been conducted using electromagnetic radiation. Visible light, the things that you can see, X-rays, microwaves, other sorts of radiation. But that kind of radiation hits a wall, so to speak, at a certain point in the past, prior to which the universe was opaque. And so these kinds of observations have a sort of horizon beyond which we cannot peer. We cannot look further back into the past because we have no information from behind that wall, so to speak, in which, and it's not a physical wall, I mean it's a horizon beyond which we cannot look because the universe was opaque at that early stage. But that early phase of the universe is transparent to gravitational waves. And therefore, if we can use these gravitational waves to look back into the history of the universe, we will be able to peer beyond that horizon all the way back to the beginning of the universe, to the Big Bang itself, and to have information about that early era. So this could potentially be the final verification of the beginning of the universe predicted on the basis of Einstein's theory.
Hi, Dr. Craig. Thank you for coming back to Singapore to speak to us. I just have one question regarding something Vilenkin seems to have said. He seems to have said you can evade the theorem, his BVG theorem, by postulating that the universe was contracting prior to some time.
Yes.
Has anyone postulated that?
Oh, of course. This is a very old attempt to avoid the beginning predicted by the Standard Model. The idea was that prior to our expansion of the universe was contracting down and then hit a sort of neck in the hourglass and then bounced back and expanded again. And what Vilenkin points out is that although that type of model evades his theorem, nevertheless it faces all sorts of other problems that render it untenable. And for example, it runs into problems with thermodynamics. You would have to have the universe declining in entropy from eternity past until it hits that bottleneck and then increases again. And that would be utterly contradictory to the second law. So there are all sorts of independent reasons. And that was the gist of the 2012 paper that I quoted from Vilenkin, where he looks at these other scenarios that evade his theorem, but shows that for other reasons are untenable. And then he says, what I quoted, none of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Craig. There's two parts. Can you expand more on how it can be, how the cause can be a personal God, and second, how it points to the Christian God? Because we can persuade our friends.
This doesn't point to the Christian God. Al-Ghazali, after all, was a Muslim, right? So as I say, this is a debate that played itself out among Jews, Muslims, and Christians, because they all share the belief in the creator of the universe. So this is an argument for the existence of God, which is common property of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Now, to address your first question, how does it show the personhood of the cause? I think this is one of the most ingenious insights of Al-Ghazali's argument. The idea here is that the cause of the universe is permanent and eternal. It's never began to exist. And that is the cause of the universe, right? Well, if that cause is really sufficient for the universe's existence, then why isn't the universe just as eternal and permanent as the cause? And think of the example I gave of the water. If the cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below zero, then if the temperature were always below zero, the water would always be frozen from eternity. It couldn't just begin to freeze a finite time ago. So if the cause of the universe is sufficient for its existence, and the cause is eternal and permanent, why isn't the universe always there? Why isn't it permanent as well? And Ghazali's argument, which I think is brilliant, is that the only way to get out of this dilemma is to say that the cause is a person endowed with freedom of the will. Because if you have freedom of the will, you can do things spontaneously without any sort of prior determining conditions. So, for example, a man who's been sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up. And so you would have an effect with a beginning from a cause which is eternal. So this, it seems to me, is a brilliant argument for saying that we're not dealing with an impersonal cause of the universe. We're dealing here with a personal creator of the universe who has freedom of the will and therefore is able to do something spontaneously and genuinely new.
Thank you.
So Craig, my name is Daniel. I'd like to ask a question. I'd like to pick your brain on what you think reasonable means. If someone comes to faith because he or she was miraculously healed, for example.
Because he or she what?
Was miraculously healed.
Yes.
Yes. His or her faith would not be blind faith in the Kierkegaardian sense.
No.
But would it be reasonable to you? And what role does apologetics have to help her to continue to build
All right.
her faith?
This is a very, very good question, actually. And I would follow the lead of someone like Alvin Plantinga, who is perhaps the world's greatest Christian philosopher. He would say that something is rational if in believing this you violate no epistemological duties, if you are within your rights in believing this, and if your system of beliefs exhibits no fallacy in its structure, if there is no defect, so to speak, in the structure of your beliefs. So those would be two accounts of what it is for something to be reasonable. A belief is reasonable if you are within your rights in holding that belief, and if in believing that you exhibit no defect in your cognitive structure. And I would say, as Plantinga says, that the fundamental way in which we know that God exists is actually not through arguments and evidence, it's through the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. And for someone who's been miraculously healed, they could certainly be within their rational rights in believing in God and exhibit no defect in their cognitive structure. And that belief could be grounded in the witness of the Holy Spirit to that person.
So you would say that that would be reasonable?
Oh,
I think?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what role then does apologetics have for a believer like this person?
I like to distinguish between knowing our faith to be true and showing our faith to be true. The fundamental way in which we know our faith to be true is through the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. This is what I think Paul and John teach in the New Testament. But when we encounter an unbeliever who asks us to give reasons for our faith, then in showing him what we know to be true, we present arguments and evidence that are based upon good empirical and other sorts of facts, and which are logically valid. So we know our faith to be true fundamentally by the witness of the Holy Spirit. We show our faith to be true through the presentation of sound arguments and evidence for our faith.
Thank you. If you could indulge me one more short question. What is training in apologetics? You alluded to that in your first sharing, to be trained in apologetics. What does it look like in the church? What does it look like in one of the
now, if I
study programs?
understood you, the question was, what is training in apologetics?
Yes, that's right. How is it different
Very
from
good question.
divinity? Yeah.
First and foremost, I think that Christians need to understand the rules of logic. I think this will be tremendously beneficial to you if you will get an Intro to Logic textbook and learn the basic rules of logic. All reasoning is governed by only about 9 basic rules of logic. And if you will learn and memorize and you learn to use these rules, this will help you to construct positive arguments for God's existence, which are logically valid. And believe me, it will help you to spot logical fallacies in the objections and arguments that are brought against Christianity, because most people don't know the rules of logic. And so their arguments are often full of holes and missteps. So that would be, I think, one of the most fundamental and basic is to learn the rules of logic. Then after that, I would try to develop some arguments for God's existence. I think this is really fundamental to a Christian worldview. We are theists. And it's scandalous that so many Christians, when asked, why do you believe that God exists, don't have anything to say. If you can simply memorize, say, 3 or 4 of these arguments, like the Kalam argument, when the non-believer says, well, I don't think there's any evidence for God's existence, you can look at him wide-eyed and say, really? Is that what you think? Well, I can think of at least 3 arguments for God's existence. And at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then you're ready to go. And you share with him your memorized arguments and talk about it. Have a good conversation. So we need to have some arguments for God's existence in our arsenal that we're ready to share at the drop of a hat. And then not the last thing, but I'd say the next thing would be some reason for thinking that Christian theism is true. How do you move beyond just belief in God to the Christian God? And here, the person of Jesus of Nazareth will be absolutely central. We need to have some familiarity with the evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Who Jesus thought he was and claimed to be, and then some reason to believe those claims were true. And I think that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead provides a very powerful case for believing that Jesus was who he claimed to be and that God has decisively revealed himself to us in the person of Jesus. So that would be the twin pillars of your positive apologetic. The existence of God and his decisive self-revelation in Jesus. Now, if you want to go beyond that, then you could also try to develop answers to the main objections to Christian belief, like why is there all this suffering and evil in the world? Why does God seem hidden to us? But that would be the last stage. The more important stage is to develop a positive case for Christianity. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about being trained in apologetics.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Dr. William Ringrick. Assuming that God is timeless and spaceless, how do we actually view of the fact that He created us in His own image?
That He's created us what?
In His own image.
Oh, in His own image. I would say that this refers to God's being personal. That in the same way that God is personal, we are persons. Now, we are finite persons, whereas God is an infinite person. We have limited knowledge, goodness, willpower. God, by contrast, is all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good. But we are self-conscious, intelligent, moral agents endowed with freedom of the will, and in that sense stand apart from the entire rest of the animal world in bearing and being the image of God.
So what about the verses ascribing properties to God in terms of His image, such as a sword and a robe? Sorry. I quote, "Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man." Would it be fair if we embody God, since He is an unembodied man?
What one would say is that the Bible often uses anthropomorphic images of God. Riding on a chariot, on the clouds, even saying things like, "The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and His ear is open to their prayer." These are all anthropomorphic descriptions of God. But the Bible is very clear that God doesn't have a physical body. Jesus said, "God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth." So God Himself is a mind without a body. We are minds with a body. God is an unembodied mind who has created the universe. But this is difficult for non-philosophers and non-theologians to conceive, and so people often use anthropomorphic descriptions of God having arms and eyes, ears, and things of that sort.
So when we worship and we pray to God, is that what we think about an unembodied mind?
I didn't catch the first part of the sentence.
So when it translates to real life, when we worship and we pray to God, for example.
When we worship and pray to God?
Yeah. What do we think of Him? Do we think of Him as just
well, okay. Now this is really a good question. I think that one of the benefits of training in theology and apologetics is that it will give you a more majestic and profound concept of God that will affect your worship. The person who thinks of God as a sort of humanoid figure seated up in heaven has an inferior and finite understanding of God compared to the person who properly grasps that we're talking here about an incorporeal, transcendent, omnipotent, omniscient being. And that, I think, will affect your worship. It will make your worship of God more profound. You will be more greatly humbled by your utter insignificance compared to a being of that sort than thinking of God as sort of like Zeus. That is not the God that Christians properly worship.
So last question, personally...
Sorry, I think we need to give time for the answer, so we can carry on the discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Firstly, Dr. Creed, thank you for two very excellent opening sessions.
Thank you.
I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and one of the things that has troubled me is that the scientific evidence for Creator God is overwhelming. And if you study the human body, for example, we're actually a marvel of precision in creation. And there is a lot of artistic expression in that creation as well. But there's been a great deal of scientific work which has attempted to contradict the existence of a Creator God. And I would think that, with all of the evidence that is before us, there's so much more evidence for a Creator God and for a finite creation of the universe, a singularity, that you wonder why scientists don't turn to God in droves. So I'm curious about that. What stops someone with all of this knowledge, and he's in the right position to determine the veracity of this knowledge from turning to faith?
I do not like to speculate on the psychological motivations of unbelievers. I think as a philosopher that's inappropriate for me to do. What I simply do is to examine their arguments and to see if these arguments are sound or not, and to expose fallacies or lack of warrant for their arguments. And in that way, it avoids becoming personal. I don't have to say, the reason you don't believe is because your heart is closed-minded to God, or you want to live an immoral lifestyle or something of that sort. I just want to avoid those kind of personal things. But I will just say this. There have been a very interesting sociological study done by a sociologist at Rice University in Texas of the beliefs of scientists. And what she showed is that the beliefs of scientists about religious matters were generally the same ones that they held when they were adolescents, before they began to study science. It's not as though their unbelief or atheism is the result of their science. Rather, they already had those beliefs as adolescents, and then they went into science. So this is a very famous example of the post hoc, propter hoc fallacy, which says, because it's after this, it's because of this. And so people will think, well, because all these brilliant scientists don't believe, it must be that science has resulted in this unbelief and made it impossible. And that's just sociologically false. The sociology demonstrates that their religious beliefs have not been shaped by their science, but were shaped by the same things that affect all adolescents. Things like your home, maybe negative experiences in church, other things of that sort that affected them as adolescents. And that just exposes the emptiness of this claim that somehow modern science has made it hard for people to believe in God. And your own example would show that that's not true.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello, Doctor.
Hi.
Hi. I want to ask, right? You know, all the things very cheap, very profound. Okay? So just imagine if I'm a pre-believer sitting in one of the lecture hall, and you won me over with all your arguments, and my mind is clear, and the pathway to the heart is really clear. Can you show me how would you personally share Christ? How would you personally lead this person to Christ?
I would basically share with that person the contents of something like the 4 spiritual laws, which has been developed by Campus Crusade for Christ. That God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, that man is sinful and therefore separated from God, but that God sent Jesus Christ into the world to bear our sins so that through him we can know and experience God's love and plan, and that we must personally receive Jesus Christ by placing our faith in him, and then offer to lead that person in a prayer of commitment to Christ. So that's how I would do it, is just by sharing those basic truths.
I think we have time for one question, so sir, you'll be the last for the session. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. William.
Morning.
I have 2 questions. Is it okay for me to ask 2 different questions?
I didn't quite.
Ask your more important one, the one that you feel is more important.
I was a Muslim, but I converted. I have no problem in believing in Jesus. But there's a question for me about the word of the Bible. You believe that the life timeline started billion years ago, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Pardon me?
The world started billion years ago, Do you believe in that?
All right. Yes, I do believe in the standard Big Bang cosmological theory. Now, I understand that not all of you share such a belief. Some of you might be what are called young Earth creationists, who believe the world was created several thousand years ago in perhaps 6 24-hour days. And I think this material I shared can still be of help to you in evangelism. What you could say to the unbeliever is, I myself believe that the world was created miraculously by God a few thousand years ago. But I'm not pushing that on you. What I'm saying is that your own scientific cosmological theory implies the beginning of the universe and the existence of a transcendent creator. So even on your own view of the universe, you ought to believe that God exists.
But the Bible points more to the timeline is 6,000 years ago that it started.
I don't think so, no. And there have been, volumes written about this. On our website, reasonablefaith.org, there are the transcripts and the videos of my Defenders class that I mentioned right at the beginning of my first talk today. And one of the sections of that course is on doctrine of creation. And we go through the Genesis narrative and examine around 8 different interpretations of Genesis that are advocated by biblically faithful Christians today. And the literal young earth view is simply one of those. So if you're interested in seeing how Christians have interpreted Genesis 1, take a look at those Defenders lectures on our website under Doctrine of Creation.
Also in the standard model that you have shown, I've seen that the standard model doesn't show gravitons. So as for me, I don't believe that the earth is a sphere. I believe it's more of a flat because the Bible mentions more of the flat.
Okay, I didn't understand, so you'll need to repeat that again. Can you go? Flat? Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to just repeat my answer. Look at my Defenders lectures on this. I'm not going to give you a little sound bite here this morning. I have lectured for weeks on this subject, and it's all there on our website, and explain why I'm not a young earth creationist.
Also,
Sorry, I think we need to.
Yeah, okay.
So we have a chance for more Q&A in the evening as well over the next day. Right. So yeah, thank you so much for the questions. Right. Can you just join me in thanking Dr. Chen? Right. That more or less concludes the morning session. Just draw your